Hello everyone and welcome back to the Beer Junkies. Today we are going to be brewing a hard seltzer. A hard seltzer is a very crisp, dry, and refreshing drink. It can be either flavored or unflavored, but it should be very, very neutral regardless. A seltzer looks like this. It looks just like water, but it is very highly carbonated. As you can see, I've had this one out for a little bit and it's still very fizzy. It's carbonated to about 3 volumes of CO2, so it is very, very high. The first time that I brewed a seltzer, I was very nervous because it almost seemed too easy. And while it is easier than making a beer, there are some things needed to look out for, which I will mention in a couple of minutes. The two parts to a seltzer are the neutral base and then the flavorings if you want to add them. For the neutral base, all you really need is the water, table sugar, the yeast nutrients, and then a little bit of salts to flavor the water. Aside from that, that's really it. You don't need anything extra. It is a very, very simple recipe. For the flavorings, if you are flavoring afterwards, you are back sweetening, you're going to want some potassium sorbate to not to prevent any more fermentation after you add the sweetener. You're going to want the flavoring itself, which can be any flavoring from one of these beverage companies. And a lot of brewers actually also use citric acid to taste. For the sugar, you can use 100% table sugar if you would like. It will all ferment out and leave no flavors behind. Some brewers will use a 50-50 mix of corn sugar and table sugar, but that's not necessary. Corn sugar is a little bit more expensive and harder to find than table sugar. But if you want to experiment, feel free. For a 4% base, you're going to want to use about 11 ounces of sugar per gallon, and that will yield you right around 4% for your neutral base. Water profile wise, it's nothing too crazy. If you're using tap water, I would recommend getting your water profile done anyways, but you want around 50 to 150 parts per million of calcium. You don't really need to worry about any of the sulfates or bicarbonates because you're not trying to emphasize any body or anything like that. You just want that calcium for a little bit of yeast health and a little bit of flavoring for that water, just like the big water companies like Dasani and Purafina do. They add their salts in after a reverse osmosis system for the flavoring. So if you are using RO system, add some salts in. If your water profile fits into that range already, you won't have to worry about it. Depending on your water profile, you may also need to add a little bit of phosphoric acid. You won't have the enzymes of the malt to reduce that mash pH or the mash pH to the low fives, but you do want that pH to be around 5 for the yeast health. So if you need to adjust your pH a little bit, add a little bit of 10% phosphoric acid and that should do the trick. For the yeast strain, try to use a neutral one. A lot of brewers use either a champagne or a wine yeast that will ferment all the sugars out because you're going to want to get down to about a 1.000 gravity. You're not going to want really any sugar left over. So you can use either of those yeast strains. I actually used White Lab's California Ale yeast and it fermented all the way out. So whatever you do, try not to use one that is very estery or anything too extreme. Try to get one that's very neutral to get as low of flavors added as possible. Last but certainly not least, you are going to want to add in plenty of yeast nutrients. Because we don't have any malts in here, we're not going to get any of that nitrogen or any of the other nutrients that yeast really needs to take off during fermentation. So I would recommend adding whatever yeast nutrient you normally use. We use one from Fermentis. And I also recommend adding diammonium phosphate. That will really help kickstart that yeast. And I will pitch it some of that nutrient with the yeast. And then I will also add a little bit more about 2 or 3 days in the fermentation to really make sure that fermentation finishes. Because this is one where you will absolutely notice any residual sweetness. So you want to do everything you can to get that yeast to ferment all the way down to 1.000 to make sure it is a completely dry and flavorless neutral base. The process of making a seltzer is actually very easy. All you'll have to do is fill up your boil kettle with the correct volume of water, stir in your sugar before the heat is added. You don't want that flame going when you add the sugar or it could caramelize some of them and add flavors that you don't necessarily want. Add your salts and your acid if needed, and then bring it to a boil for 15 minutes. This will pasteurize it, prevent any wild yeast or any bacteria from being in there, and then simply knock out and then put it in your fermenter and pitch your yeast and yeast nutrient. And that's the whole process. It is almost scarily easy, but you have to make sure that you follow these simple steps. For the flavorings, you can, after you ferment it into your bright tank, you can add in any puree you want with some potassium sorbate to prevent any additional fermentation. But what I like to do is I like to make the neutral base, and then I would like to add in the puree afterwards into the glass so that I can have a bunch of different flavors and I'm not limited to one in the kegs. So that's basically the entire process of making a seltzer. So now that we've talked through it, I'm going to walk you through it. So join us as we brew our seltzer. Hello everyone, so we are brewing the seltzer today, and even though we don't need to add any salts for the purposes of enhancing sweetness or body or anything like that, we still need to add in the salts for taste, just like water companies like Dasani do when they use their RO system to purify their water. So I'm going to be adding calcium chloride and gypsum, just like normal, to get some of that flavoring and to reduce the pH a little bit. So I've got my salts here. I'm going to mix in some of my water so I can pre-mix that. I'll mix these in as my boil kettle is filling up with the water that I need. We're using our RO water as normal. And to this, I will also add a small amount of acid because I don't have the enzymes in the malt to lower the pH to 5.2 for me, or to the low fives that the yeast want it to be at. So I have to do that myself with phosphoric acid, and we add 10% phosphoric acid. So I will get all of this mixed up together, and I will add it to the boil kettle. We will fill the boil kettle up to 100 gallons. Add the sugar in before we turn the heat on so we don't scorch anything or caramelize anything. And then we will bring it to a boil for 15 minutes to pasteurize it, and then put it through knockout and add the yeast. It's a very simple process. It almost concerned me as it was too simple the first time I did it, but we will walk you through it. Once we have the water profile where we want it and we have the volume that we want, we will stir in our sugar. We make sure to add the sugar when the heat is not on so we do not caramelize any of those sugars to add extra flavor. All right, so we filled up the boil kettle. We got it right at 115 gallons, right where we want it. We are heating it up right now. We're at about 190 degrees, so we got a ways to go, but we added the sugar. So if you come over here, you can see that the pH is right where I wanted it, right in the low fives. This will be perfect for the yeast health. And looking at the refractometer, it's got me right at 1035, which is exactly where I wanted to be for starting gravity. All right, so we boiled for 15 minutes to pasteurize the sugar mixture. So now we are transferring over to the fermenter. We are pulling directly from the bottom of the boil kettle because we don't have any pile of trub from any hops or proteins because it's just water and sugar. So we're pulling from there, pushing through our hose, through the heat exchanger. We're making sure we got plenty of oxygen in that line so that the yeast is happy because it's already going to be stressed. We're pushing it over at about 64 degrees and then going down there into our fermenter. We just finished knockout, so now I just took the gravity reading, which if it adjusts here, we'll say that we are right around 1036, which is perfect. It's exactly where we wanted it. So now we will pitch the yeast in the yeast nutrient and then wait for fermentation to start. After knockout, the sugar water is at 64 degrees, which will free rise up to 67 as fermentation starts, and we will ferment it until it is done. And that is how you brew a seltzer. It will turn out crystal clear like this as long as you take your time and control your temperature. After you finish fermentation, I highly recommend you cold crash it for at least 3 days. And if you have any kind of findings, isinglass, sea moss, anything like that, I highly recommend using it to really make sure you pull any proteins, anything possible out of that so it looks crystal clear, just like water. Now that we're all done, it's time for the taste test. We are over the age of 21. We do not condone underage drinking. Please drink responsibly. Oh. Very dry, very crisp, very refreshing. If you have any questions, please feel free to visit our website, thebeerjunkies.com. We will have our full recipe posted later this week. Cheers.